As soon as I saw this model, I clicked the buy button and started doing my research into what the real life subject looked like. I just had to have it. Like a lot of you, I was a kid when the wastelands of the Mad Max universe graced our screens, and that's where my love of a V8 engine came into play, as well as my love of a badass truck, and that's where this one fits the bill. I've always been fascinated with the idea of a gun truck, and I have to admit, this one was new to my eyes. And after taking a look at historic images of them being used in Iraq, I knew this kit would find its way to the bench sooner rather than later. Interestingly enough, this is the first Trumpeter kit I've built in all my years of modeling, so join with me today and I'll take you through the construction steps and talk about some of the pros and cons with this model.
There were 38 steps to navigate, which looked simple enough for the most part. The care taken with the packaging was a nice surprise, and the kit also came with a couple of sheets of etch. The supplied vinyl tyres will no doubt catch a few groans from a few, but I quite like them and should look great once they're on the model. The only thing that was immediately noticeable though was the horrendously large connection points to the sprues. They all seemed to be in the most awkward places, and there seemed to be an unusually large number of them. Cleaning connection points is a necessary evil on every kit, but this just seemed to be that gift that kept on giving. You see what I mean about excessive and awkward moulding when looking at those rear brackets for the axles. Construction begins with the chassis elements, and other than that, cleaning of the parts as mentioned went through easily enough. There were a number of gas cylinders around the model that have been moulded as a single tube, so that was a nice touch to avoid having to fill any seam lines over those parts. The fuel tank, however, is moulded in two halves, so would require filling and sanding. I'm using a VMS black superglue to fill the seams because it dries hard, but it's easy to sand. You can also be assured that it won't shrink over time. I try to make all of those little sub-assemblies together so they can move through that filling and sanding process together. Anything we can do to increase our productivity and help us build efficiently is a good thing in my book. Once the sanding has been complete, it was time to crack open that etch that came with the kit, but I'll talk about that a little later. The engine block and transmission is a highly simplified assembly, but will give us a glimpse at the bottom of the detail should that truck ever be picked up for judging, say. Once in place, the two chassis rails can be connected. The fit of the two rear axles left a prominent seam, so it was lightly sanded. However, I used the opportunity to add some cast texturing to those parts. To me, a putty and Mr. Cement is mixed together and stippled over that part. This will create an interesting texture, but it will also help disguise that seam where the two parts joined. Those assemblies could then be attached to the chassis rails. Although it will all but be impossible to see on the finished model, I thought it might be nice to add some brake lines to the underside, and after googling a few pics, a micro drill was used to set my positions, and a small length of lead wire could be formed to loosely resemble a hydraulic line. Finer lengths of wire were then twisted together to create a batch of wires feeding the tail lights. Both of those elements were simply to add some fine detail to the finished look, so take it as that rather than any type of reference. The wheel hubs were primed in a Mr. Surfacer black and then sprayed in AK Extreme Metal Color Steel. I will be removing them when it comes time to paint, so they were temporarily held in place with a blob of blue tack to give me a look at how this chassis was coming together. Assembly continues around that chassis, fitting the various tanks and fenders, as well as beginning to assemble the trailer section that will house the pillbox on the back of the truck. For those of you who will find yourselves building this kit, I found that sub frame on the trailer a lot easier to assemble on the tub rather than trying to build it as a standalone part and then glue it onto that tub. It just felt clumsy to do it that way. The interior is basic but should present okay when peeking through the cabin windows. Assembly couldn't progress any further until I'd painted and assembled that interior, so the floor plate, backing board and dash were all painted in a NATO green, and highlights were added by adding a light green to that mix. The padding on the rear of the cab was then masked and sprayed in a red-brown, and then mixing a dark yellow into that paint mix allowed me to create variation in that finish. Removing that mask really reveals the impact that those various shades have had over that part. I can then go and start brush painting the various details around those cabin elements with acrylic paints, and then add some variation to the dash with some sponge chipping. If there was one piece of advice for the beginner out there, it would be to buy yourself a bottle of these pre-thinned panel liners. It's amazing how a basic panel line wash in a dark brown can bring a bland looking part to life. I use a combination of these panel liners around the interior and the dash. These are an enamel based wash, so cleaning up any excess of that wash that might find its way onto the part is just a matter of using a cotton bud moistened with white spirit. Decals are supplied for the dash and are unfortunately supplied on one big block of carrier film. There was no way I was going to get that to conform over those details of the dash, so I trimmed the main dial out and planned to just fit that. Surprisingly, the decals were some of the softest and most conformable I've ever used, so I made the decision to fill in those smaller dials as well. Once in place, the dashboard received an all-over satin varnish, and once that was dry, a spot of wet effects to give that look of glass on the dials on the dash, and it was looking pretty good. One last spot I thought I could improve the dash assembly was to add some wiring coming off that bottom row of buttons. I'm using various diameters of lead wire available in most hobby shops. However, a good substitute for this type of thing is solder wire or even fuse wire. For the windows on the doors, I wanted to pose them so it looked like they'd been wound down. So they were first removed using a sharp knife and then glued in place. I could now use the Ammo Ultra Glue to install the clear parts. This is more or less a white glue, but it's surprisingly aggressive once it dries. Using this means also there is no risk of fogging those clear parts with a modeling cement or a super glue. You may have noticed the exhaust pipe had been attached to the cabin here and has a beautiful mesh heat screen around it, which feels like a good time to talk about the etch. Let's talk about etch, baby. Let's talk about etch, baby. Photo etch is one of those elements in a kit that either excites you or terrifies you. For me, it's kind of somewhere in the middle, if I'm being honest. I purposely haven't spoken about it yet because I thought I'd cover it here all in one go. The etch comes with a clear liner either side, which is great in preventing it from pinging off the fret when you cut it. But I like to give my etch a quick sand to scuff it up. This will help it to hold the glue and the paint that will then follow. When trimming etch, it's important to do it on a solid, hard surface because if you try to do it on a cutting mat, it can deform and unnaturally warp the parts. A quick sand to remove any burrs and it's time to bend. In a lot of cases, a good pair of flat nose pliers with no teeth is an adequate tool for most basic folds, but more complex pieces require a folding tool. I'll leave a link down below for a good one, however you can get them at just about any hobby store. A good folding tool is a great start to embracing etch for those of you who may be a little intimidated by it. And also a quick word on annealing before we talk about glue. Annealing is the process of heating the part with a blowtorch or flame if you like. And what that does is it softens the etch part and makes it easier to manipulate. A word of caution, however, because it is possible to melt or burn your part, so take care with using this technique. Superglue is the best option to adhere your etch parts, although there are other options such as PVA and LED curing resins. I'm using that black superglue here again, mainly because it gives me a look at where it is over the part, and it is somewhat slow drying, giving me a window to posture that part into the correct position. But back to the build, and now to the business end of this thing, and we'll move on to the tub that houses that steel pillbox. I could now go around and start fitting a host of brackets and etch tie downs. They look a little awkward at this point, but should make sense under paint. I broke everything down and primed the various bits and pieces with, again, that Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. I spray straight from the rattle can, and it's something I do outside, so no video for that part, sorry. I'm painting the fuel tank and selected canisters around the model in an aluminium colour, and then I'm looking to add red brown as well in some of the areas I'm intending to add some chipping to this model. In particular, I'm focusing on those areas around the front bull bar and some of the guards. Because I'm painting with lacquers, I can almost immediately apply my 2 coats of that chipping fluid. The chipping fluid is an acrylic-based product and can be cleaned up using water. It looks beaded and ugly going on, but if it looks like that, you probably know you're on the right track. Time for the NATO Green, and this is a colour I always find myself fighting against. As I've mentioned before, I like to paint light with a view that the weathering stages will pull everything back and get me to the tone I'm looking for. I find I struggle to hold the tone of this NATO Green when I try to lighten it, and it probably doesn't help that I'm actually colorblind, but that's a conversation for a different day. I'll take you through the steps I took to get it to a place I was happy, but for what it's worth, I'd encourage you to experiment with this color for yourself. I began the application using Tamiya NATO Green and applying it in that mottled finish you're probably used to seeing me do from other builds. The black undercoat is contributing to that imperfect finish, and the colour is looking pretty good. My fear is though, if I don't pull that colour back and add some highlights, it will become overly dark when it comes time to pin wash. Hence, I'm looking to lighten that green colour up by adding a dark yellow 2 to the mix. I tested that lightened mix over the chassis and the areas that will soon be obscured, and once happy, start working them over the horizontal surfaces and raised details. By reducing my coverage, I'm keeping that initial NATO Green colour as my shadowed areas and creating lightened variation in that colour. It probably doesn't look as obvious on the screen now I'm watching it back, but the colour looked quite bland to my eye, so a heavily thinned mix of yellow-green was misted over that model. This creates a filter which should help bring some richness back to that green. The NATO brown patches were applied, but I was struggling to even see them, and after inspecting the progress decided I wanted to create even more contrast in that green, so I grabbed an RLM02 and focused on the roof and the bonnet. The RLM02 was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, and it gave me that elusive highlight colour I'd been looking for. I really wanted to make sure that black camouflage sat proud off the green, and once I started to apply it, I knew I was on the right track. I'm using the flat black from the AK Real Colour range and have thinned it to around 50-50 thinner to paint. This paint is pre-thinned already, but by thinning it further, I can control the amount of overspray and ensure I'm able to freehand those shapes slowly and carefully. I try to follow the scheme supplied in the instructions as best I can. Then, true to form, I introduced dark sea grey to that black mix and enhanced the black elements with that lightened tone. It helps add some life to an otherwise deep and dark colour. I was very happy with the overall look of that scheme, so I then added some chrome to the headlights with the SMS Hyperchrome pen, and then looked to fit the clear parts using that ultra glue. The row of red lights on the roof were pre-painted in clear red and then also glued in place. The wheels again are held in place with blue tack here, and the trailer and armoured guards that I'd painted earlier were glued in place. I'd painted and assembled the pillbox and temporarily sat it in the trailer. And yes, I hear you asking, but how did you achieve those rusted steel effects? They do look cool, don't they? And I promise you, I will show you how I did it. But given this video is starting to get a little bit longer in time, and there was a bit involved in creating those effects, I think those techniques deserve their own time and space. So I'm going to share that one with you next time and call this one closed for today. It's not often I buy a model and start building it the day I receive it, but I found this truck so interesting and so different to the subjects I usually model, I just had to sink my teeth into it straight away. I love that improvised and raw nature of that pillbox thrown on the back of a trailer, thrown on the back of a truck. It's like it has one wheel in reality and the other in the zombie apocalypse. And I just love the opportunities a model like this gives us to experiment with weathering effects, as well as the opportunity to learn about something different from the usual panzers and tigers we tend to model. This model is essentially broken into 4 main areas of construction. First up, there's the interior and the opportunities that provides to create life to that subject. Then of course, there is the challenge of executing that NATO 3-tone on the cabin. The trailer tub and guards are the next area of unique interest, but the best part of all of this is that corroded steel pillbox, at least in my opinion. It's a bit of a case of function over form, and those primitive lines and construction paired with that look of that naturally corroding sheet metal really is the golden egg of this kit. I loved every minute of this build so far, and I can't wait to get a start on the weathering, because that is really where this beast will come to life. Plenty of movement over on the Patreon page with plenty of new members. Shafe, or aka the mediocre middle-aged modeler, and Darren Tice coming on as my latest wombats. And a few kangaroos have joined into the fold as well. So thank you to Sean Atron, Feebleworks, and Roy Pedersen. It's been great seeing these modelers' works and sharing ideas with them, and their support is truly making a difference to this channel. Next week, I'll be looking at the February announcements that caught my eye, and then we'll take a deep dive into this truck. But for now, guys, remember, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
No deals. I want to drive the truck.